Hello, this is Evan English and Katherine Sarmiento, and the topic we're going to be discussing is virtual reality, as commonly referred to as VR. So, what is virtual reality? Essentially, VR is a term used to describe, a three-dimensional computer-generated environment that can be explored and interacted with by a person. The Virtual Reality Society, gives us this definition, and they also add to it by saying the person becomes part of the virtual world and is immersed within it, and while they're there, they can manipulate objects and perform a series of actions. Some of the items that can generate this environment are the ViewMaster, Google Cardboard, HTC Vive, and others.
Virtuality is a means of creating an illusion that a viewer is actually present at a screen and that it's being portrayed. So, the earliest example of this was the 360-degree murals or panoramic paintings from the 19th century. So, the mural painted for the Battle of Borodino was created in such a way that the viewer is almost right in the middle of it.
Continuing with the history of VR, we skip ahead and we see another mention, and this is the Pygmalion Spectacles, a work written by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Essentially, it's a science fiction that predicted virtual reality to a T, including all the current senses and possibly future senses that we may be able to interact with VR. As well, in the mid 50s, Morton Heilig invented what was called the Sensorama, essentially as an arcade-style cabinet that would simulate all the senses. It featured stereo speakers, a stereoscopic 3D display, fans, smell generators, and even a vibrating chair.
In 1960, the first VR head-mounted display was created. In 1987, the study of the field was finally given a name to encompass it, and it was virtual reality. That same year, Visual Programming Lab, VPL, sold the first VR goggles for $9,400 and VR goggles for $9,000. In 1993, Sega announces VR glasses with head tracking, stereo sound, and more, and it was a huge flop, and it was only in the prototype phase. And then in 1995, the first ever publicly sold VR console had some success, and it was called Nintendo's Virtual Boy. So VR is very hard to market, and it can't really be described as an experience unless the user actually tries it. There's a lack of software. Virtual Boy and most other systems were cumbersome and really difficult to use. Some people experience motion sickness, and it is extremely pricey.
So there is a series of solutions that makes this current wave of VR possible. One of the biggest is actually just allowing more people to actually experience VR, including demos in shopping malls, conventions, and so on, so that they can see it firsthand and spread how they feel via mouth or word of mouth. As well, there's more software support. Essentially, there's whole new game developers and other entities that develop pieces of software for VR. Also, there's less motion sickness now that most displays have a higher refresh rate, so it's not as jarring. And as well, the cost and ease of use has gone down for some forms of VR. So there are still the higher end still is a bit prohibitive due to the cost of a powerful PC, but overall the cost and ease of use has gone down.
VR has become a household term recently. Google helped by launching the Cardboard, an extremely consumer-friendly version of VR in 2014, followed by Samsung's Gear VR. Multiple new devices released like Google Daydream, Oculus Go, and the latest iteration of HTC Vive, and increased consumer presence have made it very popular today.
So with the current VR systems, there's essentially two types. They are mobile, which mainly uses smartphones with relatively cheap headsets that allows more users to get involved with VR. And then there's also the tethered form. These are the higher end systems that have to be physically connected to PCs and have much higher quality components. So with VR, there will be many effects across multiple different industries. One of the first would be retail. There are certain companies that are creating software to make virtual maps of users' bodies so that they can try on clothes in a 3D environment. Also, the military and defense industry, they started using VR for simulations in combat environments and other environments for communication and so on. As well, there's different events and conferences that essentially allow for virtual tourism.
VR has helped law enforcement because it allows officers to train in certain scenarios, and it gets a gauge of officers' interactions with other testing, and it also really helps with recruiting because it's different formats of meeting.
So, with a look ahead to VR's future, there's three main points that will most likely be tackled. That being, VR will get more physical, essentially more senses will be appeased. VR will become more of an industry-wide effort, meaning a lot more funding and outside help. And finally, there may be the act of removing the tether in tethered VR, meaning the high-end machines will be able to run it easier.